The Valerie Empire did not conquer worlds through passion, ideological fervor, or the chaotic, unpredictable rage of battlefield adrenaline. They conquered through a rigid, calculated system of structural efficiency that reduced the chaotic art of war to a predictable series of engineering problems. To a Valerie, combat was entirely a matter of geometry, mass, and superior energy output, leaving absolutely no room for artistic expression or physical flair. Their bodies were massive, naturally armored by thick, unyielding external exoskeletons that made them look like walking monolithic statues composed of dull slate and interlocking chitinous plates. Because their biological framework was heavy and structurally rigid, their military doctrine had naturally evolved to match their physical limitations over thousands of solar cycles. They did not duck, they did not weave, and they never attempted to evade an incoming strike. Instead, they simply absorbed the impact with their dense shells. They advanced across the battlefield in slow, deliberate, geometrically perfect lines, relying on heavily reinforced portable bulkheads and the overwhelming, continuous firepower of their high-output plasma rifles to grind their opponents into dust. General Xylar of the 3rd Vanguard Fleet sat in the cold, unyielding metal command throne of his cloaked reconnaissance vessel, his primary chitinous eyes tracking the gentle, slow rotation of Earth on the massive viewer before him. To his analytical mind, this blue world was not a vibrant cradle of culture or life, but merely a collection of logistical equations waiting to be systematically balanced by his fleet. The data streams humming across his tactical console indicated a soft, unarmored native population that relied almost entirely on primitive combustible engines, fragile chemical projectiles, and easily broken internal bone structures that lacked any form of natural external shielding. It looked like a trivial acquisition for the Empire, a routine deployment that would be forgotten within a single stellar cycle. The atmospheric analysis is finalized, General, his secondary tactical officer clicked, its lower mandibles rubbing together in a dry, rhythmic hiss that signaled absolute certainty in their data. The targeted sector for our initial drop is a suburban domestic zone located in the North American continent. Their localized defensive infrastructure is entirely non-existent, consisting of fragile wood and glass dwellings. A standard orbital suppression sweep will disrupt their communications networks and force systemic compliance within 3 solar cycles. The weapon technicians are prepared to unlatch the primary kinetic batteries on your direct command, sir. Xylar adjusted his heavy shoulder pauldrons, the metallic joints of his command armor clicking into place with a stiff, automated whine that echoed sharply in the sterile cabin. The Valerie Code demands a physical infiltration and a direct biological survey before a single orbital charge is dropped, officer. Do not let the apparent softness of their skeletal structures deceive you into skipping baseline reconnaissance protocols. I will descend to the surface myself under an active optical camouflage field to ensure no anomalies exist. I want to observe their physical mechanics in a localized, low-stress domestic environment. If we understand exactly how their bodies move when they are at rest, we will know precisely how to deploy our heavy ground units to maximize psychological shock. The stealth pod departed the ventral bay of the flagship without a sound, a sliver of dark, radar-absorbent alloy slicing silently through the midnight clouds of a quiet Ohio suburb. Xylar stepped out onto the damp earth, his heavy, 3-toed boots sinking slightly into the manicured lawn of a peaceful residential neighborhood. Activating his personal optical camouflage, his towering 7-foot frame dissolved into a subtle, translucent shimmer against the dark background of the suburban foliage. He marched steadily toward a wide, glowing double-paned glass viewport of a nearby house, entirely confident that this night would provide nothing more than the final, trivial data points required to authorize a total planetary sweep. Xylar positioned himself perfectly outside the frame of the window, his advanced thermal sensors filtering out the ambient humidity to focus entirely on the 3 human specimens resting inside the brightly lit room. They were sitting on a plush fabric structure, their soft, unarmored bodies completely relaxed, lacking any tension or stance that resembled a defensive military posture. Yet, What completely arrested Xylar's processing units was not the biological vulnerability of the family, but the massive, flickering light projection illuminating the wall across from them. The humans were completely silent, their expressions fixed in a state of high curiosity amusement as they watched a piece of recorded cultural media. On the display, a human male with dark hair was moving through a chaotic, heavily cluttered marketplace, completely surrounded by 4 hostile combatants who were closing in on his position. Xylar's tactical visor instantly began to calculate the kinetic metrics of the scene, but the internal tracking software began to stutter and misfire, unable to map the trajectories according to standard Valerie combat variables. The human on the screen was entirely unarmed, possessing no plasma sidearm or kinetic rifle, nor was he attempting to retreat behind an armored barrier or call for heavy mechanized support. Instead, his movements defied every established principle of Vanguard strategy, utilizing a bizarre method of kinetic evasion. He ducked beneath a swinging fist, his spine bending backward with a fluid, elastic flexibility that would have instantly shattered a Valari's rigid chitinous torso into fragments. In a single, seamless explosion of kinetic momentum, the human grabbed a simple wooden chair from the floor, kicked its leg to spin it into the air, caught it by the structural frame, and used it to trap the arm of an attacker while simultaneously using his own jacket to blind a second opponent. "What is this defensive matrix?" Xylar muttered to himself, his upper mandibles twitching violently in the darkness as he adjusted the resolution of his visor to account for the blur of motion. There is no localized energy signature radiating from his limbs. There is no thermal buildup in the surrounding space. He is utilizing the kinetic inertia of his own body mass and the chaotic geometry of the surrounding environment as a mechanical force multiplier. On the screen, the actor, a human named Jackie Chan, performed an effortless backflip off a brick wall, caught the rungs of a falling utility ladder with his arms, swung through the gaps to strike 2 opponents simultaneously, and landed in a low, perfectly balanced defensive posture with a wide, mocking grin. Inside the living room, the human family did not cower in terror at this display of lethal physics. Instead, they erupted into casual laughter and applause, entirely comfortable with the gravity-defying violence playing out on the screen. Xylar stood frozen in the bushes, his cloaked hands trembling slightly against his side armor plates as his mind struggled to reconcile the scene with his military training. Valerie soldiers were trained to fire straight lines from fixed, immovable positions, relying entirely on their tech to keep them alive. If a Vanguard trooper was disarmed of his rifle, he became a clumsy, slow-moving target waiting to be crushed by the enemy. But this human was entirely different. His entire body was a decentralized system of levers, springs, and perfectly channeled momentum that could turn any ordinary object into a lethal instrument. Xylar realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that if the Valerie Armada landed their heavy, rigid troops now, the humans wouldn't just fight them with conventional weapons. They would scramble up their heavy armor plates, use their weapon barrels as physical leverage, and throw them directly into their own landing gear. The sheer unpredictability of their movement would bypass every automated targeting system in the fleet's inventory. "The tactical invasion reports are fundamentally flawed," Xylar whispered into his encrypted wrist communicator, his voice dropping into a low, strained frequency that shocked his sub-officers aboard the flagship. "The human population possesses a highly sophisticated, secret martial doctrine that allows them to weaponize their own environment without energy signatures. They refer to it as Hollywood. Hold the Armada deployment indefinitely and lock down all kinetic batteries. I am extending my reconnaissance mission on the surface. I must personally decode this kinetic methodology before we fire a single shot, or we risk total tactical embarrassment." The cold morning sun cut through the heavy gray smog of the suburban strip mall, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. General Xylar stood perfectly still beneath the faded blue awning of the retail block, his internal sensors adjusting rapidly to the ambient noise of terrestrial traffic and the distant hum of power lines. Underneath his sophisticated holographic disguise matrix, which flawlessly projected the outward appearance of a tall, remarkably rigid human male named Max. His true Valerie skin felt tight and uncomfortably confined. His natural slate gray plates were locked down beneath the simulated flesh, forcing him to maintain a posture that looked less like a casual civilian and more like a pristine architectural pillar. He adjusted the collar of his newly acquired cotton shirt, a garment that felt incredibly fragile compared to the heavy blast armor he had worn for the last 3 decades of his military career. The logic of this environment remains highly inefficient, Xylar murmured to himself, his internal vocal synthesizer translating his thoughts into a deep, gravelly human baritone before the sound could escape his lips. They aggregate their commerce centers in low-density zones, yet they train their premier kinetic operatives in the immediate vicinity of a grocery store. It suggests a lack of centralized military planning. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his simulated lungs to mimic the rhythmic rise and fall of human respiration, before he pushed open the glass door of the strip mall suite. The words written across the window in bold, vinyl lettering read Miller's Martial Arts and Calisthenics Academy, a title that Xylar's tactical database had flagged as a primary training node for the localized populace. The moment he crossed the threshold, the distinct, sharp scent of polished oak wood, heavy canvas mats, and dried human sweat hit his artificial olfactory sensors, triggering a series of chemical diagnostic alerts on his wrist console. The interior was brightly lit by a row of humming fluorescent tubes, completely devoid of the protective bulkheads or tactical blast shielding that characterized a standard Valerie training bay. At the far end of the polished wooden floor stood Sensei Miller, a lean, soft-spoken human male with silver-streaked hair tied loosely behind his head, currently adjusting a stack of canvas training pads. He stopped his work as the door chimed, turning his sharp, analytical eyes toward Xylar's towering, unyielding frame with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with mild amusement. He walked across the floor with an incredibly light, fluid cadence, his feet making almost no sound against the wood, a detail that Xylar's visor instantly flagged as a highly advanced form of acoustic dampening behavior. "Welcome to the dojo, big guy," Sensei Miller said, extending a calloused hand toward the disguised alien commander with a calm, completely relaxed smile. "You must be Max. You called about the adult introductory enrollment yesterday, right? I have to say, you look like you've already spent a lifetime lifting steel girders, but you're holding your breath like you expect the ceiling to cave in on you." Xylar stared down at the extended hand for a fraction of a second, calculating the exact pressure required to reciprocate the human greeting without crushing the fragile bone structure inside Miller's palm. He gripped the hand smoothly, executing a single, rigid vertical shake before releasing it according to his decoded protocol files. "I am Max. That is correct. I have arrived to systematically acquire your foundational doctrine of kinetic conservation and environmental movement. I require enrollment in your primary instructional cycle immediately." Miller let out a short, easy laugh, shaking his head slightly as he stepped back to gesture toward the changing rooms at the back of the facility. "Well, you certainly talk like an engineer, Max. We can definitely get you started. But I'll tell you right now, we don't do things systematically or clinically here. We do them through repetition, sweat, and a whole lot of failing until your body remembers how to move without your brain getting in the way. Go ahead and change into the white uniform on the bench back there, and then join the line on the mats." 10 minutes later, Xylar took his place at the absolute rear of the beginner's line, his bare feet gripping the textured surface of the canvas mats with an intense, calculated grip. He was surrounded by 6 other humans, all of them significantly smaller and structurally softer than his holographic disguise suggested, yet they all possessed a loose, casual flexibility that he found deeply disconcerting. When Miller took his position at the front of the room, bowing deeply to initialize the session, Xylar mirrored the movement with a stiff, automated bend of his torso that caused his internal joint servos to hiss quietly beneath his holographic skin. "All right, class, we're going to start with basic alignment and standard core punches," Sensei Miller announced, walking slowly down the line as the students assumed a wide, low horse stance. "I want everyone to drop your weight into your heels. Keep your spine straight but fluid. When I give the count, you snap your reverse punch from the hip, but remember to let the tension go. If you lock up your muscles before the impact, you're just fighting your own body. A highly illogical principle, Xylar thought to himself, his mind calculating the physics of a strike based on Valerie military manuals. Maximum structural density should yield maximum kinetic transfer. Relaxation is a direct compromise of defensive integrity. 1. Miller called out, his voice sharp and resonant. The line of students snapped their right arms forward, their fists punching the air with a collective, rhythmic whoosh of displaced air. Xylar executed the command with absolute, uncompromising force, hardwiring his reflexes to drive his arms straight along a mathematically perfect linear trajectory. His holographic fist stopped exactly where he intended, but the sheer, rigid velocity of his movement was so sudden and stiff that the disguise matrix across his shoulder blade flickered with a faint, microscopic static charge. Sensei Miller stopped walking immediately, his eyes locking onto Xylar's stance with a deep, contemplative frown. He walked over to the giant white belt student, circling him slowly like a commander inspecting a faulty piece of heavy artillery. He reached out, gently tapping Xylar's rock-hard shoulder muscle, which didn't budge an inch under the pressure. "You've got incredible power, Max. I can feel the air moving from across the room," Miller said, his tone shifting into a gentle, instructional warmth as he placed a hand on Xylar's hip to adjust his angle. "But you're completely missing the point of the movement. Look at your shoulder. It's locked up like a rusty bolt. You're punching entirely with your arm, which means you're stopping your own momentum the moment you hit the end of your reach. Watch my stance again. The power doesn't originate in the fist, Max. It starts in the ground, travels up through the legs, rotates the pelvis, and explodes through the knuckles. It's a continuous chain reaction of weight distribution." Xylar remained perfectly still, his internal processing unit rapidly translating Miller's verbal description into a complex kinetic flowchart on his HUD. "A chain reaction of weight distribution," he repeated internally, his mandibles twitching beneath his disguise as the logic began to click. He is not generating force through mass alone. He is generating force through the sequential acceleration of separate biological segments. "Try it again, but this time, don't try to punch through a brick wall," Miller encouraged, stepping back to give him room. "Just let the weight of your hip carry the hand forward. Relax the muscle until the exact microsecond of impact." 2. Xylar took a slow breath, consciously disengaging the primary locking servos in his upper torso, allowing his holographic frame to sink an inch lower into the mat. When the count landed, he drove his foot into the floor, allowed his pelvis to swing forward in a sharp, pivoting motion, and let his arm snap out like a loose metal cable. The fist cut through the air with a remarkably different sound, a deep, whip-like crack that resonated off the wooden walls of the dojo. "There it is," Miller yelled, a wide, enthusiastic smile breaking across his face as he clapped Xylar on the back. "That's the flow, Max. You keep practicing that coordination, and you're going to understand exactly what the old masters meant when they said the body is a river, not a stone." Xylar stood in his stance, his sensors analyzing the residual vibration traveling through his leg plates. The output data was undeniable. The strike had required 40% less energy to execute, yet the terminal velocity at the point of impact was nearly double his previous attempt. He looked down at his simulated human hands, a sudden, profound realization washing over his tactical mind. The human military potential wasn't hidden in their armaments or their defensive fortifications. It was locked inside the sheer, fluid efficiency of their biological architecture. They were born as engines of momentum, and he had only just begun to read the operating manual. The passing of 6 Earth months did not dull General Xylar's obsession. If anything, it accelerated the deep cover operative's descent into the intricate mechanics of human movement. By the time the sweltering heat of the terrestrial summer began to beat down on the suburban strip mall, the alien commander had systematically earned his brown belt, his progress marked by a meticulous adaptation that baffled Sensei Miller. Inside the dojo, Xylar had ceased to move like a mechanical block of stone, having successfully trained his artificial muscle memory to mimic the sequential, whip-like snapping of human joints. Yet, his primary advantage remained entirely computational, as his Valerie mind constantly mapped the spatial geometry of the training floor in real time. During intense sparring sessions, his visor calculated his partner's weight distribution and hip rotation milliseconds before they fully formed the intent to strike, allowing him to glide out of danger with a heavy, rhythmic grace that looked impossibly sharp to the human eye. "Your progress is downright unnatural, Max," Sensei Miller remarked one evening, wiping down the sweat-stained mats as the rest of the adult class filed out into the humid night air. He stopped to lean heavily against a stack of kicking shields, watching Xylar execute a flawless, slow-motion kata that perfectly maintained the core center of gravity throughout 3 consecutive direction changes. "Most guys your size take years just to stop tripping over their own heels when they pivot, but you move like you've got an internal gyroscope regulating every single square inch of your stance. Where did you say you worked before you moved to this sector?" Xylar completed the final defensive block of the sequence, slowly bringing his feet together and lowering his hands to his sides as he allowed his simulated respiration to level out smoothly. "I was engaged in high-density logistical coordination and structural management for a large-scale Vanguard firm, Sensei. My duties required absolute precision in spatial planning, geometric allocation, and the rapid mitigation of conflicting physical trajectories. The principles of your martial doctrine correlate directly with the physics of structural stabilization that I am accustomed to managing." Miller let out a soft, appreciative whistle, tossing a clean linen towel across the floor toward the disguised general. "Logistical coordination, huh? Well, that explains the brainwork, but it doesn't explain how you managed to catch a falling wooden training staff with your foot during yesterday's defensive drill without even looking down at the floor. That wasn't just geometry, Max. That was pure, split-second instinctual awareness of your immediate environment. You didn't just dodge the impact. You integrated the weapon into your own defensive arc exactly like the classic stuntmasters do in the old films. The integration of localized environmental assets is the true core of kinetic conservation," Xylar replied, his deep baritone voice steady as his internal processors logged the instructor's praise into his psychological database. "If an operative relies exclusively on a single fixed weapon system, the loss of that asset results in immediate tactical vulnerability. By converting ordinary structural elements into temporary defensive tools, the individual remains a highly effective combat unit regardless of systemic disarmament. I have observed this exact methodology thoroughly documented in your cultural cinema archives." Miller laughed heartily, walking over to clasp a firm hand onto Xylar's shoulder, a gesture that the alien commander now accepted without any rigid defensive bracing. "You've been watching way too many old Hong Kong imports on your days off, my friend, but honestly, it's working for you. Keep that exact mindset alive, because this weekend we're hosting the regional demonstration, and I want you leading the advanced self-defense application segment. Don't be afraid to show the crowd exactly how a big guy can use momentum to rewrite the rules of a fight." When the afternoon of the regional demonstration arrived, the dojo was packed to the doors with local spectators, family members, and visiting martial artists, creating a loud, high-density environment that initially sent Xylar's tactical threat assessment subroutines into overdrive. He stood at the edge of the mats, dressed in a crisp, pristine white uniform with his brown belt tied in a flawless square knot, his holographic disguise maintaining absolute visual stability despite the minor electromagnetic interference from the crowd's mobile communication devices. In the third row of the bleachers sat a man named Marcus Vance, a professional Hollywood stunt coordinator whose sharp, critical eyes had spent the last 2 decades evaluating physical talent for major film productions. Marcus was currently scouting the region for fresh, physically imposing performers who could execute complex choreographic sequences without relying heavily on digital editing or stunt doubles. "All right, Max, you're up," Sensei Miller signaled, gesturing toward the center of the floor where 3 advanced black belt students were already waiting to simulate a multi-attacker scenario. Show them the fluid application of environmental defense. Keep it controlled, keep it safe, but don't hold back on the timing. Xylar stepped onto the polished wood, his bare feet grounding his massive frame as the 3 simulated opponents instantly closed the distance, attempting to surround him from 3 distinct geometric vectors. The first attacker lunged forward with a rapid, straight-line striking combination, but Xylar didn't step back into a standard defensive block. Instead, he stepped directly into the attacker's blind spot, using a subtle redirection of his palm to channel the human's forward momentum into the path of the second oncoming combatant. In the same fluid movement, Xylar dropped his weight beneath a high-swinging kick from the third opponent, sliding seamlessly across the smooth floor beneath a long wooden folding bench that had been placed near the boundary line. Before the crowd could register his location, Xylar executed a powerful, controlled handspring off the deck, popping up behind the bench and catching its steel frame with the tip of his foot to tip it upward as a temporary tactical shield. He utilized the rotating momentum of the bench to intercept a strike, spun it back to the floor with perfect kinetic conservation, and delivered a beautifully extended crescent kick that stopped precisely 1 single inch away from his partner's chin. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds to complete, moving with a heavy, visceral weight that made the complex choreography look devastatingly real yet completely effortless. The crowded room erupted into a wave of enthusiastic applause and cheering, the sheer volume of the human emotional output causing Xylar's internal sensors to spike with data. As he bowed formally to his sparring partners and stepped off the mat, Marcus Vance immediately rose from his seat in the bleachers, pushing his way through the crowd with a look of intense, professional fascination written across his weathered face. He approached the disguised alien commander, pulling a heavy, gloss-coated business card from his pocket and presenting it with an expression of absolute certainty. "Excuse me, Max, right?" Marcus said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the dojo as he handed over the card. "My name is Marcus Vance. I'm the lead stunt coordinator for a high-budget martial arts feature film starting production up in Detroit next month. I've been sitting here watching you move for the last 20 minutes, and I have to tell you, your spatial timing is completely ridiculous. It's like you have the precise calculations of a machine, but you've got this heavy, visceral momentum that would look absolutely incredible on a wide-screen theater display. Have you ever considered doing professional stunt work for the cinema?" Xylar looked down at the glossy card, his internal linguistic processor instantly analyzing the structural parameters of the offer. "Stunt work," he repeated slowly, ensuring his vocal synthesizer maintained its calm, human cadence. "You are requesting that I perform simulated, highly complex kinetic combat scenarios within a controlled environment for the explicit purpose of mass cultural distribution?" "That is exactly what I'm saying," Marcus replied, a wide, excited grin breaking across his face as he gestured toward the dojo floor. "Our lead actor needs a formidable, highly precise physical antagonist who can handle intricate, rapid-fire choreography without needing a double to hide the mistakes. Your weight distribution, your spatial awareness, and the way you use the environment are exactly what classic action cinema has been missing. What do you say, Max? Are you ready to show the rest of the world what that kinetic doctrine of yours can really do?" Xylar slid the card securely into the pocket of his uniform, his mind running a massive parallel simulation of the strategic possibilities this offer presented. He was not merely entering a training facility anymore. He was being invited into the absolute heart of the human cultural apparatus known as Hollywood. "I accept your proposal, Director Vance," Xylar stated, his posture settling into a balanced, commanding stance. "I will report to your production coordinates. Let us begin the implementation of this cinematic choreography." The industrial outskirts of Detroit were wrapped in a thick blanket of gray morning mist when General Xylar arrived at the production location, a massive, decommissioned automotive assembly plant that had been completely repurposed into a state-of-the-art soundstage. The sheer scale of the human cultural apparatus was immediately staggering to his strategic calculations, as he walked past rows of catering vehicles, mobile equipment trailers, and towering crane rigs holding massive lighting diffusers in the air. Underneath his flawless holographic disguise matrix, his Valkyrie systems were operating at peak efficiency, silently logging the precise coordinates of every structural asset, camera position, and safety crew member. He was dressed in a rugged, dark utility outfit provided by the wardrobe department, a costume designed to make his tall, physically imposing frame look like a hardened underworld enforcer on camera. He carried himself with a controlled, measured weight, his feet making rhythmic, deliberate contact with the concrete floor as he approached the main staging area where Marcus Vance was currently reviewing the day's choreographic storyboards. "Ah, there he is. Everyone, eyes up, this is Max, the man I was telling you about," Marcus shouted across the noisy floor, gesturing enthusiastically for Xylar to join the core production team near the center of the set. A dozen technicians, camera operators, and stunt performers paused their work to inspect the towering newcomer, their analytical eyes scanning his broad shoulders and unyielding posture with a mix of professional curiosity and underlying respect. Marcus walked over, slapping a heavy hand against Xylar's shoulder with a welcoming grin that completely bypassed the formal rigidity of a military briefing. "Max, I want you to meet Christian Bale, our lead actor for this sequence, and Tom, our primary camera operator. Today, we are shooting the warehouse confrontation, which is the emotional and physical climax of the second act. The script demands a high-intensity, rapid-fire melee where Christian's character is completely overwhelmed by your size and environmental precision before he manages to find a desperate opening." Christian stepped forward, offering a firm, polite handshake which Xylar accepted with the exact, mathematically calibrated pressure required to simulate human biology without causing structural injury. "It's a pleasure to work with you, Max," Christian said, his voice quiet and intensely focused as he looked up at the disguised alien's imposing height. "Marcus hasn't stopped talking about your spatial timing since the regional demonstration last week. This entire sequence relies on absolute trust and razor-sharp precision. We are moving at full speed through a highly cluttered space, using prop iron pipes, wooden crates, and metal chains as improvisational shields. If our timing is off by even a fraction of a second, someone is going to the hospital. How are you feeling about the flow of the choreography?" Xylar allowed his vocal synthesizer to output a calm, deep human baritone that resonated clearly through the ambient noise of the warehouse. "The structural parameters of the sequence are fully understood, Christian. I have executed a comprehensive spatial analysis of the set layout, including the mass distribution of the designated prop items and the geometric constraints of the camera tracks. My physical responses are hardwired to prioritize kinetic conservation and spatial awareness. I will maintain an exact defensive perimeter of 1.5 inches from your person during all striking vectors, ensuring maximum visual impact on the recording sensors without risking biological compromise to your frame." Christian blinked in surprise, a brief, amused smile breaking across his face as he looked over at Marcus. "Well, he certainly has the confidence of a seasoned veteran, Marcus. I love the intensity. Let's get into the space and run a slow-motion technical rehearsal before the director calls for a live take." The staging area was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, designed to simulate a grimy, abandoned industrial storage bay filled with rotten wooden pallets, rusted iron chains hanging from overhead gantry cranes, and scattered metal barrels. For the next 2 hours, Xylar and Christian moved through the complex choreographic steps, breaking the fight down into distinct, sequential segments of motion. Xylar's Valkyrie mind found the process deeply fascinating, as he realized that human stunt work was not an attempt to inflict maximum damage, but a highly sophisticated physical dialogue where each participant utilized their momentum to tell a story of struggle and resilience. He trained his simulated limbs to react with terrifying velocity while simultaneously holding back the raw, bone-crushing structural force of his true Valkyrie strength, ensuring that every block, sweep, and strike looked devastatingly real on the camera monitors. "All right, everyone, reset to 1. We are going live on this take." The director yelled through a megaphone, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel ceiling as the safety crews cleared the floor and the massive camera cranes swung into their starting positions. The set grew completely silent, the heavy hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clicking of the cooling fans creating a high-tension atmosphere that caused Xylar's internal threat assessment subroutines to cycle rapidly. Camera rolling. Background action. And action. The moment the command left the director's lips, Christian lunged forward with an explosive, high-velocity combination, swinging a heavy prop iron pipe toward Xylar's head with a look of absolute cinematic fury written across his face. Xylar didn't flinch or retreat into a rigid defensive posture. Instead, he executed a flawless, low-friction duck that allowed the pipe to whistle precisely 2 inches above his holographic hair, utilizing the downward momentum of his torso to drive a powerful sweep across the concrete floor. Christian leapt over the sweeping leg with athletic grace, spinning in midair to launch a heavy reverse kick aimed directly at Xylar's chest. Calculating the kinetic trajectory instantly, Xylar caught a hanging rusted chain with his left hand, using its swinging inertia to pull his entire frame out of the path of the kick while simultaneously throwing a large wooden crate into Christian's path with his right arm. Christian smashed through the breakaway crate, utilizing the scattering wood pieces as visual cover to launch a desperate, close-quarters tackle that forced both performers to crash heavily into a stack of metal barrels. The impact resonated through the warehouse with a deep, thunderous boom, the barrels scattering across the floor in a mathematically chaotic pattern that looked incredibly visceral on the wide-screen viewfinders. Xylar rolled through the impact smoothly, popping up into a low, animalistic defensive stance, his simulated breathing perfectly synchronized with the dramatic pacing of the scene as Christian scrambled backwards, gasping for air against a concrete pillar. Cut! Cut! Holy hell, that was absolute gold! The director screamed, jumping out of his chair behind the main monitor bank and clapping his hands together with pure, unbridled enthusiasm. The entire crew erupted into loud applause and cheers. The sudden wave of human emotional energy washed over the set like a physical force. Marcus Vance ran onto the mats, a massive, triumphant smile breaking across his weathered face as he looked at the 2 sweating performers. Max, that was the most beautiful piece of heavyweight fight choreography I have ever seen committed to digital film. The way you caught that hanging chain and integrated its weight into your evasion looked entirely organic, like you were rewriting the laws of physics on the fly. Look at the monitor. Look at how the camera captures the sheer mass of your movement. Xylar walked over to the playback station, his primary eyes tracking the high-definition footage on the screen as his internal processors analyzed the visual sequence frame by frame. He watched his holographic persona move through the cluttered space with a heavy, terrifying grace, his actions blending seamlessly with Christian's performance to create an unforgettable narrative of physical mastery. There were no plasma blasters, no automated targeting systems, and no heavy kinetic shields. Just the pure, unadulterated expression of biological momentum and structural intelligence. He looked down at his simulated human hands, feeling a strange, deep resonance vibrating within his chest cavity that had nothing to do with the cold metrics of military victory. He realized, with an absolute and unwavering certainty, that this human cinema was a far more powerful force than any orbital bombardment his fleet could ever deploy, and he was no longer just an observer, he was the weapons designer. The editing bays of the Detroit studio were bathed in a dim, cool blue light that contrasted sharply with the vibrant, high-velocity images flickering across the master editing suite monitors. General Xylar sat completely motionless in a deep leather chair at the back of the room, his unyielding frame casting a long silhouette against the soundproofed walls as his holographic disguise maintained its flawless, human exterior. For 3 consecutive days, he had joined Marcus Vance and the post-production team, watching the assembly of the raw footage into a seamless, high-impact narrative structure. His advanced Valerie mind processed the flickering frames at an elite computational speed, analyzing how the clever juxtaposition of camera angles, sound design, and physical rhythm could elevate a simple sequence of human body mechanics into an earth-shattering psychological experience. He could feel the profound, undeniable weight of human storytelling pressing against his established military conditioning, eroding the cold, logical calculus that had guided his centuries of service to the Empire. "Look at this transition right here, Max," Marcus whispered, leaning over the glowing mixing console to point a calloused finger at the frame-by-frame breakdown of the warehouse melee. He clicked a button, slowing the playback down to 24 frames per second, allowing the rhythmic, visceral impact of Xylar's chain-swinging evasion to unfold with breathtaking clarity. The way you hold back your weight just enough to let Christian's character counter-strike gives the audience this massive rush of dramatic tension. It's not just a fight. It's a physical debate where both sides are pushing themselves to the absolute brink of survival. The test audiences in California are completely losing their minds over your performance, man. They're calling your character the most formidable, physically intelligent screen antagonist of the decade. Xylar allowed his vocal synthesizer to output a calm, measured human baritone that carried a deep, reflective cadence through the quiet room. The efficacy of the sequence relies entirely on the precise management of kinetic anticipation, Director Vance. By withholding the ultimate structural force of the strike, the observer's mind is forced to calculate the potential devastation, thereby amplifying the psychological engagement with the narrative. It is a highly sophisticated optimization of resource allocation. We are generating maximum emotional resonance while expending a minimal amount of actual physical disruption to the environment. Marcus let out a low, appreciative chuckle, shaking his head as he tapped a sequence of keys to lock in the final audio mix of a shattering wooden crate. "You have the most beautifully clinical way of describing art I have ever heard, Max, but whatever you want to call it, it works. You've given this film a soul that standard digital special effects simply cannot replicate." Tomorrow morning, the studio is executing a synchronized global digital release across all major data streams, and I genuinely believe your life as an ordinary logistics coordinator is officially over. Before Xylar could formulate a calculated response, his internal tactical receiver began to vibrate violently against his natural collarbone, a secure, high-priority military emergency frequency overriding his civilian network protocols and projecting a flashing red alert icon directly onto his hidden HUD. He stood up smoothly, executing a polite, formal nod toward Marcus. "I must step outside the facility to manage an urgent logistical anomaly regarding my primary firm, Director Vance." The final cut is highly satisfactory. He walked out of the editing bay with a rapid, heavy stride, pushing open the heavy fire doors to step into the isolated, concrete alleyway behind the studio where the cold night air could clear his sensors. He activated his wrist console, tapping a secure encryption key that manifested a miniature, low-frequency holographic display of his flagship's primary bridge right before his primary eyes. The visage of his secondary tactical officer appeared on the screen, its lower mandibles rubbing together in a frantic, uncoordinated friction that signaled an extreme state of bureaucratic panic and operational distress. "General Xylar, we have successfully bypassed your network blockades to establish direct tactical contact," the officer hissed, the background of the Valerie Bridge buzzing with the chaotic hum of armored personnel scrambling toward their designated combat stations. "The High Council has officially revoked your reconnaissance extension, sir. The planetary alignment with Earth's primary defensive centers is completely optimal, and the Supreme Flagship's ventral plasma batteries are fully charged to 100% capacity. The Emperor himself is demanding the immediate transmission of the primary invasion coordinates. Why has the ground assault been withheld for so many solar cycles?" Xylar looked down at the glowing screen of his personal human communication device, which was currently flooded with early press reviews and celebratory messages from the production crew. He looked back up at the image of his frantic officer, his mandibles twitching beneath his holographic disguise as his mind achieved absolute, unyielding clarity on his true mission. "Deauthorize the bombardment parameters immediately, officer, and order all vessels to disengage their primary targeting locks," Xylar commanded, his voice dropping into a low, resonant military frequency that instantly silenced the chatter on the distant flagship bridge. "I am uploading a comprehensive, high-definition data stream directly into the High Council's main tactical feeds. You will patch this synchronized visual package into every single command monitor across the entire Vanguard Armada immediately. The officer's primary eyes widened in utter bewilderment, its claws hovering hesitantly over the communication array. Sir, a synchronized data stream of the native infrastructure? Is this a comprehensive blueprint of their primary defensive network or a map of their combustible fuel reserves? Tell the Emperor it is the ultimate kinetic doctrine of the human species, Xylar replied, his posture settling into a balanced, commanding martial stance that exuded absolute authority. Tell them it is a recording of our initial physical engagement with their premier operatives, and it represents a paradigm of strategic mastery that our current military manuals are completely unequipped to counter. Watch it, analyze it, and wait for my next deployment directive. Within 3 minutes, the raw, high-definition final cut of the Detroit feature film was broadcasting simultaneously across every monitor of the massive Valerie invasion fleet. In the Supreme Council chambers, the Emperor of the Valerie sat motionless on his obsidian throne, his heavy, slate-gray armor clicking quietly as his primary eyes locked onto the 90-minute display of human physical genius. The entire High Command stood in absolute, breathless silence as they watched the human characters slide, leap, and weave through spaces with the terrifying velocity of guided projectiles, utilizing balance, humor, improvisational geometry, and raw athletic willpower to overcome impossible physical odds. They watched Max execute the fluid, whip-like chain evasions, his heavy movements perfectly synchronized with the human actor's momentum to create a flawless dance of kinetic destruction. The impact on the Valerie consciousness was immediate and utterly devastating to their rigid military doctrines. For thousands of stellar cycles, their civilization had been dry, heavy, and culturally stagnant, having completely traded the magnificent potential of their natural bodies for automated targeting computers, mechanical servomotors, and long-range plasma weaponry. They had forgotten the pure, visceral beauty of physical motion, replacing their strength with thick armor plates that made them slow and predictable. As the film transitioned into the end credit sequence, showing the raw behind-the-scenes outtakes where the human performers fell, sustained minor injuries, laughed, stood right back up, and dedicated their entire biological existence to perfecting a single 3-second sequence of movement, the Valerie High Council realized a profound truth. The humans were not vulnerable because they lacked armor. They were terrifying because their entire bodies were the weapon, and their cinema was the training manual. The potential war of global conquest had vanished from the Empire's calculations, replaced entirely by an overwhelming, collective obsession to understand the secrets of the flow. The global digital release of the Detroit feature film shattered terrestrial box office records within 48 hours, but its most profound impact was unfolding hundreds of miles above the planet's surface. Inside the sprawling hangar bays of the Valerie Supreme flagship, the standard rhythmic clanking of automated maintenance machinery had been replaced by a strange, heavy silence. Thousands of heavily armored Vanguard troopers stood in perfectly aligned rows, their primary chitinous eyes glued to massive structural projection screens that repeated the film's climax on an endless, analytical loop. For the first time in the history of the Empire, soldiers were consciously disengaging the primary locking servos in their heavy shoulder pauldrons, attempting to mimic the fluid, rolling hip rotations they had witnessed on the monitors. The cold, mechanical certainty of their orbital conquest had evaporated, replaced entirely by an overwhelming, systemic fascination with the kinetic genius of a soft-skinned species that weaponized momentum instead of plasma batteries. Down on the bridge, the secondary tactical officer stood before the Supreme Command console, its lower mandibles twitching with a frantic, uncoordinated friction as it reviewed the latest cultural data feeds arriving from the surface. General Xylar, the ideological shift across the Vanguard ranks is accelerating beyond our capacity to regulate, the officer reported, turning its heavy head toward the terminal as Xylar's secure transmission line hummed to life. The troops are systematically ignoring their standard marksmanship drill intervals, sir. They have begun constructing crude, unarmored training enclosures inside the cargo decks, utilizing heavy loading chains and structural scrap metal to simulate the environmental variables of the human warehouse melee. Even the High Council has suspended all tactical planetary mapping sessions. The Emperor has spent the last 3 solar cycles reviewing the historical archives of human physical choreography, explicitly demanding to know if our chitinous skeletons can survive a flying side-kick maneuver. Xylar allowed his vocal synthesizer to output a deep, prideful human baritone that echoed clearly through the flagship's bridge speakers. The response of the Empire is entirely logical, officer. Our military doctrine has spent millennia constructing thicker armor shields, effectively converting our population into slow, predictable statues that rely exclusively on technological force multipliers. The humans have proven that true strength is not a matter of static mass, but the absolute, fluid mastery of spatial geometry and weight distribution. They do not hide from the environment, they integrate it. Prepare my primary transport shuttle for immediate atmospheric descent. We will finalize our planetary arrival not with an orbital suppression sweep, but with a formal diplomatic approach to their primary cultural centers. And what of our primary plasma batteries, General? The officer clicked, its posture settling into a remarkably balanced, human-like stance that it had subconsciously absorbed from the film loops. Should we maintain a secondary defensive charge in the ventral weapon arrays just in case the native population reacts with immediate hostility to our arrival? Lock down all kinetic batteries permanently and vent the localized plasma cells into the vacuum, Xylar commanded, his voice carrying the absolute, unyielding authority of a leader who had discovered a superior evolutionary path. We will descend to their primary administrative center in Washington, D.C., completely stripped of our automated combat shielding. If we approach them as rigid conquerors, they will simply use our own heavy mass as leverage to break our lines. We must approach them as students seeking the true secrets of the flow. 2 solar cycles later, a massive, triangular shadow slipped silently through the upper atmosphere over the nation's capital, its dark, radar-absorbent hull reflecting the bright morning sunlight as it hovered directly over the expansive grass of the National Mall. The terrestrial defensive networks immediately erupted into a state of high alert panic, with military sirens wailing across the city and tactical response units scrambling to establish a defensive perimeter around the towering alien vessel. Millions of citizens watched through their mobile communication devices as the massive ventral cargo ramp of the flagship slowly lowered, venting a dense, pressurized cloud of white steam that hissed against the damp earth. The human soldiers braced for an apocalyptic confrontation, their weapons raised and fingers resting tightly against their chemical triggers as the mist slowly began to clear. Out of the steam stepped General Xylar, but he was completely unrecognizable to the tactical scanners that had logged his initial profile. He had completely discarded his heavy, motorized command armor, standing exposed in a simple, high-durability human martial arts GI that had been meticulously tailored to fit his massive, 7-foot frame. His natural slate gray plates were completely visible, yet his posture carried an incredibly light, fluid balance that completely defied his immense biological weight. Behind him marched a 12-member diplomatic envoy of Valerie high officials, all of them stripped of their traditional weapons and dressed in clean, matching athletic tracksuits, their heavy shoulders dropped and relaxed in a perfect display of martial humility. The human military commander, a hardened general named Vance, who happened to be the distant cousin of the stunt coordinator Marcus Vance, stepped forward with a megaphone, his voice trembling slightly despite his years of combat experience. Identify yourselves and state your operational intent immediately. You are entering a restricted defensive zone of the United States sovereign territory. Any aggressive physical action will be met with immediate, high-velocity kinetic force. Xylar stepped forward with a slow, deliberate cadence that made absolutely no sound against the grass, his spatial sensors calculating the exact distance between himself and the human lines. He brought his massive, 3-toed feet together, tucked his arms neatly to his sides, and executed a flawless, mathematically perfect 45-degree bow toward the stunned human general. Greetings, administrative commander of the terrestrial sector, Xylar announced, his vocal synthesizer projecting a clear, respectful baritone that resonated across the silent plaza. I am General Xylar of the Valerie 3rd Vanguard Fleet. We have not descended to unlatch our kinetic batteries or enforce systemic compliance upon your populace. We have arrived to officially initiate diplomatic negotiations regarding a comprehensive, multi-galaxy licensing and distribution treaty with your primary Hollywood production institutions. General Vance lowered his megaphone slowly, his brow furrowing into an expression of utter, unbridled confusion as he looked from the giant alien to his tactical officers. A licensing treaty? For what? You brought an entire interstellar armada to our capital to talk about movie distribution rights? We require immediate structural access to your premier calisthenics academies, stunt coordination facilities, and cinematic archiving vaults, Xylar explained, a proud, distinct click echoing in his mandibles as he gestured toward the massive fleet hovering in the sky above. Our empire has spent generations trapped in a state of rigid physical stagnation, and your cultural media has revealed the profound limitations of our defensive architecture. We possess the resources of 32 star systems, and we are prepared to trade our advanced atmospheric filtration designs and clean energy blueprints in exchange for direct, continuous instructional seminars from your master stunt coordinators. We wish to learn how to properly execute the flying sidekick, Commander. The tension that had locked down the entire city broke in an instant, replaced by a surreal, historic wave of collective human realization. Within less than a year, the terrifying prospect of an interstellar war of attrition had dissolved completely into the most lucrative, universe-spanning box office boom in global history. The surface of the Valerie homeworld was completely transformed over the following decade, its cold, obsidian military trenches filled in and replaced by sprawling calisthenics parks, high-velocity gymnastics complexes, and massive, multi-tiered IMAX projection domes that operated 24 hours a solar cycle. Human actors and stunt performers became the most highly compensated diplomats in the galaxy, traveling across the stars to teach rows of eager, giant alien troopers how to loosen their shoulders, relax their cores, and roll through a high-impact fall without damaging their chitinous shells. The galaxy no longer had any reason to fear the thunderous march of the Valerie Vanguard, because the entire empire was far too busy sweating on the canvas mats, dedicating their lives to the beautiful, fluid science of the human flow.